April 17th, 1944. The wind carries the smell of turned earth and distant coal smoke across the flatlands of Lincolnshire. Beyond the barbed wire perimeter of Camp Grant, the English countryside stretches in shades of green and brown, interrupted only by the skeletal frames of half-constructed Nissen huts and the rhythmic clatter of a distant train. Inside the prisoner of war compound, Oberleutnant Franz Becker stands at morning roll call, his Wehrmacht tunic faded from repeated washing, his face expressionless as the British guards count heads. 347 German soldiers stand in neat rows, 347 men accounted for. The count is correct, as it has been every morning for 9 months. But tomorrow, it will be wrong. Franz Becker is 28 years old, a former schoolteacher from Bavaria, who became an officer not through military ambition, but through the simple arithmetic of war. Germany needed officers, and educated men were convenient candidates. He was captured in North Africa after the collapse of the Afrika Korps, when Rommel's Desert Army crumbled beneath the combined weight of British and American forces. The surrender came as a relief. He had seen enough sand, enough death, enough of the brutal machinery that transformed men into statistics. When British soldiers took him prisoner in Tunisia in May 1943, he felt something unexpected, the loosening of a terrible burden. The journey to England was long, first to a transit camp in Algeria, then by ship across the Mediterranean and up through the Atlantic, always moving northward toward a country he had been trained to consider an eternal enemy. The propaganda had painted Britain as a nation of weak aristocrats and subjugated workers, a dying empire clinging to past glories, while Germany forged a new order. But the Britain that Franz encountered was something else entirely. Even as a prisoner, even behind wire and guard towers, he could sense it. A quiet, resilience, a peculiar kind of orderly freedom that existed nowhere in the Reich he had left behind. Camp Grant sits near the village of Grantham, surrounded by agricultural land that feeds a nation at war. The camp is not designed for maximum security. These are not SS officers or die-hard Nazis confined here. These are ordinary soldiers, men who fought because their country demanded it, who wore the uniform because there was no alternative. The British authorities understand this distinction. The camp has guards, yes, and protocols, but there is also a surprising amount of trust. Prisoners work on nearby farms, filling the labour shortage created by conscription. They are paid small wages. They attend evening classes in English. Some have begun to wonder what their return to Germany might mean, whether the country they left still exists in any recognisable form. Franz has been planning his escape for 2 months, not because he wishes to return to Germany. That thought fills him with dread, but because he has glimpsed something beyond the wire that speaks to a deeper hunger. Freedom, yes, but more than that, the possibility of a different life, a self-determined existence in a country where the state does not consume every aspect of being. He has studied the guard rotations, noted the gaps in the patrol schedule, observed which sections of the perimeter fence remain unlit during the blackout hours. He has saved bits of civilian clothing, traded cigarettes for a compass, memorized maps of the surrounding countryside. Everything is ready. Tonight, when the moon is dark and the spring rain masks sound and movement, he will cut through the wire and walk away from the camp, away from his nation, away from the ideology that has reduced Europe to rubble. The escape is almost absurdly simple. At 2 a.m, when the night guard is on the far side of the compound, Franz slips from his barracks wearing a civilian coat over his prison uniform. He has blackened his face with ash from the stove. The wire cutters, fashioned from modified kitchen shears, work through the fence in less than a minute. The rain is steady, cold, drumming against the earth. He crawls through the gap and into a drainage ditch that runs parallel to the road. Then he stands, brushes the mud from his knees, and begins walking east toward the anonymous darkness of the English countryside. By dawn, he is 12 miles from the camp, moving through farmland and wooded areas, avoiding roads and settlements. The escape is not discovered until the morning roll call. 346. 1 man missing. Sirens wail. Police are notified. Search parties fan out across the region. But Franz has planned well. He has survival skills learned in the military, a basic understanding of English, and most importantly, a determination forged not from fanaticism, but from its opposite, a desperate desire to be free from all-consuming ideology. The Britain of 1944 is a nation utterly transformed by war. Every resource, every effort, every citizen is mobilized toward a single purpose: victory over Nazi Germany. Yet even in this total war, there are spaces that remain surprisingly unregulated. The countryside is vast. The population is preoccupied with rationing, with bombing raids, with letters from the front. A man who is careful, who speaks little, who keeps to the shadows, can move through this landscape with a ghostly anonymity. Franz becomes such a man. He shelters in abandoned barns and outbuildings. He steals food from gardens and storage sheds, just enough to survive, never enough to provoke pursuit. He avoids human contact. When he must pass through villages, he does so at night or in the early morning, his collar turned up, his gaze downcast. Weeks pass. The initial search loses intensity. The authorities conclude that he has either been captured and not yet reported, or has died in the countryside from exposure. Resources cannot be spared for an indefinite manhunt. The war grinds on. Franz becomes a rumour, a local legend, the German who vanished into the fens and fields. Some claim to have seen him. A farmhand reports a shadow moving through a hayfield at dusk. A woman in a village shop swears she sold bread to a man with a slight accent who paid in old coins. But nothing is confirmed. No capture is made. Franz settles into a kind of existence that is both terrifying and exhilarating. He finds an abandoned gamekeeper's cottage deep in a wooded area near the village of Bourne. The roof is partially collapsed, but one room remains sound. He makes this his home. He learns to move through the forest silently, to recognize edible plants, to trap rabbits. He avoids starting fires that might draw attention. At night, he listens to the BBC on a small radio he discovered in the cottage, hidden in a rusted box, probably left by a previous occupant. Through these broadcasts, he follows the progress of the war, the D-Day invasion, the liberation of France, the steady, inexorable advance of Allied forces into Germany itself. Each news report brings a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the Nazi regime is crumbling, horror at the reports of concentration camps being liberated, the full extent of the Holocaust revealed, grief for his homeland, which is being reduced to ash and ruin, and beneath it all, a growing certainty that he can never return, that the Germany he knew, if it ever truly existed, is gone forever. He is a man without a country, living in the country of his former enemy, sustained by theft and invisibility. Yet he is also, in a strange way, more free than he has ever been. The local population near Bourne begins to notice small signs of an unknown presence. Gardens are disturbed but not destroyed. A chicken goes missing, but only one. Laundry disappears from a line but is replaced weeks later, washed and folded. Some locals come to believe they are harbouring a benevolent ghost, a spirit of the woods who takes only what is needed and sometimes leaves gifts in return. Wildflowers arranged on doorsteps, firewood neatly stacked. They do not report these incidents. The war has made everyone weary of authorities and interrogations, and there is something about these gentle intrusions that seems almost comforting, a reminder that even in wartime, there are mysteries that belong to ordinary life rather than to the machinery of the state. Franz lives this way for nearly a year. Spring becomes summer, summer fades into autumn, and autumn hardens into the brutal winter of 1944. The cold is severe. Food becomes scarce. He grows thin, weakened. Several times he nearly freezes to death in the cottage, huddled beneath every scrap of fabric he can find. He considers surrender, but each time something stops him. Not fear of punishment, but fear of returning to a world of orders and ideologies, of being once again a number in a system that devours individuality. In February 1945, the war in Europe is in its final phase. Germany is collapsing. Soviet forces are closing on Berlin from the east. Anglo-American forces are crossing the Rhine. The end is weeks away, perhaps days. Franz, huddled in his cottage, listening to these broadcasts, understands that he has outlasted the regime he fled. The Nazi government will soon cease to exist. But what comes after? What happens to German prisoners of war? Will they be repatriated to a destroyed nation, put on trial, kept in camps indefinitely? The uncertainty is agonizing. One morning in early March, Franz wakes to find a young woman standing in the doorway of the cottage. She is perhaps 20 years old, wearing a practical wool coat and boots, carrying a basket. She does not appear frightened. For a long moment, they stare at each other. Then she speaks in clear, unhurried English. She says she knows who he is, or rather, what he is. The village has known about him for months. They have chosen not to report him. She says the war is ending. She says he need not hide any longer. She sets the basket down. It contains bread, cheese, a thermos of hot tea, and walks away without waiting for a response. Franz eats the food slowly, almost ceremonically. It is the first time in nearly a year that he has tasted something prepared by human hands with care and intention. The bread is still warm. The tea is sweet. He sits in the doorway of the cottage and weeps. Not from gratitude alone, but from the overwhelming recognition of what he has been given. Not just food, but acknowledgement, presence, the restoration of human connection. Over the following weeks, he receives other visitors. An elderly farmer who brings eggs and leaves them without a word. A retired teacher who brings books, volumes of English poetry, a dictionary, a history of the region. They do not speak to him at length. There are no interrogations, no demands. They simply ensure he is fed, warm, alive. They have decided, collectively and without official authorization, that this German soldier who has lived among them like a forest creature deserves their protection. Perhaps they see in him something they recognize, a fellow human caught in the vast machinery of war, trying only to survive with dignity intact. Germany surrenders on May 8, 1945. Franz listens to the announcement on his small radio. The war in Europe is over. The Third Reich, which promised 1,000 years of glory, has lasted 12 years and left a continent in ruins. He thinks of his family in Bavaria, his parents, his sister, and wonders if they are alive, if their town still exists. He thinks of his students, the children he taught before the war, and wonders what they have become, what they have been taught to believe in his absence. He thinks of the men he served with in North Africa, those who died in the desert and those who survived to become prisoners, and he wonders what futures await them. He decides to remain hidden. Even with the war ended, he is still technically an escaped prisoner. He does not know what the legal implications might be. And more than this, he is not ready to leave the strange, liminal existence he has created. Here, in this cottage, in these woods, he is beholden to no nation, no system, no ideology. He is simply a man living according to his needs and the generosity of others. It is the closest thing to true freedom he has ever known. But the decision is not entirely his to make. In June, 2 police constables arrive at the cottage. They have been informed by the villagers, not as a betrayal, but as a necessity. The war is over. There must be accounting. They find Franz sitting outside, reading a book of Wordsworth poems. He does not resist. He stands calmly, thanks them for their courtesy, and accompanies them to the police station in Bourne. The interrogation is brief and almost apologetic. His story is recorded. Officials are contacted. Within days, arrangements are made. He will not be prosecuted for his escape. He will be transferred to a repatriation center where he will wait with other German prisoners for transport back to what remains of Germany. The villagers come to say farewell before he is moved. They bring him a proper suit of clothes, money collected among them, letters of reference testifying to his good character. The farmer gives him an address in Bavaria, a cousin who might help him locate his family. The teacher gives him a book to keep, an anthology of English literature with an inscription inside, to remember that humanity persists even when nations war. Franz is overwhelmed. These people owe him nothing. He has lived among them as a thief and a fugitive. Yet they have chosen to see him not as an enemy, but as a fellow human in need. This recognition is more powerful than any ideology he was taught, more sustaining than any nationalist fervour. It is evidence of a truth the Reich denied, that ordinary goodness exists independent of state power, that compassion requires no orders from above. Franz is transported to a repatriation camp in Yorkshire. The process is slow. Germany is in chaos. The country is divided into occupation zones. Infrastructure is destroyed. Millions of displaced persons, refugees, former prisoners, survivors of camps, are seeking homes that no longer exist. It takes 3 months before Franz is finally placed on a train heading east. By the time he crosses into what is now the American occupation zone of Germany, it is autumn 1945. Nearly 2 years since his escape. 18 months since he vanished into the English countryside. Bavaria is barely recognizable. The cities are rubble. The roads are clogged with refugees. The social order has collapsed. Franz makes his way to his hometown and finds it partially destroyed by Allied bombing. His family home stands, but his parents are gone. Died in the winter of 1944, a neighbor tells him, from hunger and disease. His sister is alive, living in a single room, with her 2 children, her husband killed on the Eastern Front. They embrace for a long time, both weeping, both understanding that they are survivors of something that can never be fully explained. In the years that follow, Franz struggles to rebuild a life in the new Germany. He returns to teaching, working in makeshift schools among the ruins. He never speaks of his time in England, his escape, the year he lived free in the forests of Lincolnshire. It seems too fragile, too precious to share. It belongs to him alone, a private history held against the overwhelming public history that has consumed the world. He marries in 1949. He has children. He watches Germany slowly, painfully reconstruct itself, first under occupation, then as a divided nation, then finally, decades later, as a reunified democracy. He sees his students grow up in a country that, while imperfect, has rejected the totalitarian horrors of the past. He lives a quiet, decent life, teaching literature and history, encouraging his students to think critically, to question authority, to remember that individuals matter more than systems. But sometimes, on spring evenings when the wind carries the smell of turned earth and distant rain, Franz closes his eyes and remembers the cottage in the woods, the mornings when he woke to birdsong and the absolute silence of solitude, the nights when he listened to the radio and felt himself to be both nowhere and everywhere at once. He remembers the villagers who fed him without asking for explanations, who chose kindness over duty, human connection over abstract loyalty to the state. He remembers learning, in that hidden year, that freedom is not merely the absence of constraint, but the presence of choice, the daily choice to live according to conscience rather than command, to respond to need rather than ideology, to recognize in another human being not an enemy or an ally, but simply another soul navigating the bewildering complexities of existence. This is what the totalitarian systems could never understand, what all the propaganda and coercion and nationalist fervour could never instill. That true allegiance belongs not to flags or Führers, but to the quiet, persistent fact of shared humanity. That abundance is measured not in territorial conquest, but in generosity freely given. That the strongest social bonds are formed not through force, but through voluntary acts of recognition and care. Franz learned these truths not from ideology, but from experience, not from the grand stage of history, but from a year of invisibility in a foreign land, sustained by people who had every reason to turn him in, but chose instead to feed him, to see him, to let him live. He never returned to England, but England returned to him, again and again, in memory and in the deepest lessons of his life. It taught him that even in the darkest times, even when nations tear themselves apart, there are always those who hold fast to something deeper than a nationality, a recognition that we are all exiles in some sense, all fugitives from the absolute claims of power, all seeking shelter in the small, persistent kindnesses that make life bearable. This is the abundance that cannot be rationed or destroyed. The capacity for ordinary people to choose mercy over judgment, connection over division, life over the machinery of death. And so Franz lived and taught and remembered. The war ended. The Reich crumbled. Nations rose and fell. But the year he spent free in the forests of Lincolnshire remained with him always, a proof that even when the world narrows to barbed wire and borders, the human spirit can still slip through, can still find space to breathe, can still discover that freedom lives not in the permission of states, but in the simple, revolutionary act of being fully, responsibly, magnificently human.